too fast to take that test. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Don't wanna be a richer man. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes.
Well, we're going to pick up here with our next discussion and lecture, Chapter 20, Progressivism. And this would be from about 1900 to 1920. Prior to that time, you had a period of time that was populism, which was a bit different than progressivism. You had, with many of the populists, you had rural people, people with not much education. For the most part, they had ideas that never came into being, but progressives were a little more forceful, getting their ideas passed through. They pushed things like women's right to vote, direct election of senators. When it came to alcohol, they pushed to, in many cases, to ban alcohol, and they were successful by 1920. So you had a lot of changes during that time, because a lot of people felt that reform was needed to cure social ills. And I think, other than maybe being a 100% libertarian, I think many people probably believe that's true, that there has to be reform to cure social ills. How do we do that, though? Is that the government's responsibility? Is it the individual's responsibility? How do we change society? When we look at the three progressive presidents, starting with Taft and Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson, we see three presidents that wanted reform. Roosevelt, I guess when we look at him, he's an interesting case, because he took over when McKinley was shot in 1901. When he was vice president, finished out his term, then he won the election in 1904. And then he did something that was, I guess, a bit unusual, some people might believe. He stepped aside in 1908, and he handpicked William Howard Taft, who, of course, always has the reputation for being our largest president, 335 pounds on a good day. And Taft would serve one term, and while Roosevelt was off hunting in Africa, a big game hunter, he saw some things that he didn't like going on in the Taft administration, so he came back to America and ran for president against Taft. The problem was the party gave Taft the nomination. Roosevelt got angry and stormed out of the convention and started a third party called the Bull Moose Party, a progressive party. And then he would run against Taft in the Democratic nominee, and of course that's going to be Woodrow Wilson. Real name was Thomas, but went by Woodrow. And Roosevelt actually came in second place in that election. Wilson would win, and Taft would finish a very disappointing third place with only 8 electoral votes. When you look at Teddy Roosevelt, I think he's always quite often mentioned in the top 5 or 10 presidents of all time. He, of course, like I mentioned before, was a big game hunter. He liked to hunt bear. Some of you know the story in Mississippi where he was hunting hunting bear, and couldn't find one, and finally one of his hunting party found a mother bear, a female bear, dragged it into camp, tied it to a tree, and said, "Mr. President, there's your bear, shoot it." And about that time, a baby bear came running across. The little cub sat in front of the mother, and Roosevelt put his gun down and said, "I can't shoot that bear." Of course, a toy company got a hold of that story, and they wanted to make teddy bears, and they wanted to use his name, and that's where the term teddy bear came from. He had some pretty terrible things happened to him in his life. His wife died on Valentine's Day, 1884, the same day as his mother. And I guess we could say Valentine's Day was never a real happy day for Roosevelt. He had many hats in his life. He was a conservationist, a vice president, a president, a police commissioner, and did a lot of government jobs, a rancher in the Dakotas after his wife died. Was a boxer, physically fit fella. Although boxing didn't go so well, he was injured in one of his eyes and was nearly blind after that. So the progressive presidents really had an important role in trying to cure America's social evils, and we'll talk about some of those in a few minutes. When we look at industry during this time, Henry Ford, of course, was at the forefront with the Ford Motor Company. Ford started the assembly line, and they could crank out a new Ford car every couple hours or less. And he used to say, Ford used to say that you can have any color as long as it's black. And that's how they saved money, by buying just black paint. Of course, it was difficult to find your car downtown because everybody's car was black, and almost everybody drove a Ford, it seemed, because he got the price to where it was about $850 you could buy a new car. And he gave Ford employees, of course, a break when they bought those cars. We had muckraking journalists. We had, I mentioned a while back, and people like Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book called The Jungle, where he went into meat packing companies and toured the factories. And in 1906, he found some pretty nasty stuff that meat companies were throwing into meat, like rope, ground up rope and chalk, rat poison. And back then, you didn't have to put the ingredients on packages. You had, of course, the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, because now the government forced companies to put labels and ingredients on packages, and that started changing some things. We had inspectors go into these places to make sure that these companies were on the up and up. We also had some tragedy in industry and factories at that time. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire happened. This was in New York City, where 146 women died. Most of them were immigrants who were working in a shirtwaist factory. They made dresses, and the fire broke out, and some of them climbed out of the windows. The door was actually locked at that time, and they couldn't get out, and they busted the windows and climbed up on the next floor, waited for help to arrive. Some women jumped. There was no fire drills back then, sprinklers, nothing like that. They did have a fire hose, but I remember reading once at one time the hose was rotten, and the water just gushed out of the sides when you tried to use the thing. So by the time the fire department showed up, they had a ladder that reached up to the 6th floor, a wooden ladder at that. It's kind of like bringing a knife to a gunfight. You're trying to put out a fire with a wooden ladder. So the wooden ladder caught on fire, plus it only went up to the 6th floor, and they were on the 8th and 9th floor. So like I say, a lot of these women jumped to their death, and it was a terrible tragedy. When they had the funeral in New York City and they marched down the streets, there were about 100,000 people that showed up to watch this march, and they demanded change, and that's that's what they pushed for, in better conditions in these factories. Another muckraker that was popular during this time, Ida Tarbell. She went after Standard Oil. Of course, Rockefeller had a monopoly and made deals with railroad companies, and she tried to expose that to the American people. African Americans and other minority women were of course, making some headway at this time. W.E.B. Du Bois was an African American leader. He was part of that group called the Talented Tenth, which included many teachers and professors and lawyers and professional African Americans who of course pushed for change, and eventually the NAACP was formed out of this in 1909. Women wanted, of course, voting rights, and that happened eventually with the 19th Amendment in 1920. We had the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators before that time. Before we had elected 2 senators per state, those two senators were actually chosen by state legislatures. The people didn't have a direct vote in that, and of course the 17th Amendment would change that. A couple interesting things to think about as we close. One is Teddy Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate in 1912 and came in second place. And I mentioned James Weaver the last chapter, and he ran as a populist and didn't do as well. Do third parties have a chance in America? And this may be something we discussed before, but do they? Will they ever? And if they will, what will have to change for that to happen? Another question to think about is what in society today needs change? We talk about progressivism, and quite often when you look at the last election and Bernie Sanders running as a Democrat, although he was an independent, but often caucuses with the Democrats. And he wanted big-time change. Obama, when he ran for president, he, of course, hope and change and hope. And change is one of those words that we hear often. What needs to be changed in American society? What are some of society's ills today that either the government or families or churches or private organizations can do to change some things? And is change always a good thing? Just because somebody wants change, does that always mean it turns out to be a positive change? And lastly, even though women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920, we've had women senators and representatives and governors and important positions in CEOs in companies. We haven't had a woman president yet. Of course, Hillary ran in 2016 and didn't win, but did Hillary not win because she was just the wrong woman, or do we still have a bias out there that women, although they can be on the Supreme Court and be senators and representatives, etc., can't be president? Do we still have this bias in our mind, or is that just the way things turned out?